Hey guys, Ron here. Welcome to another video. Tonight my subject is, I've been thinking a lot about the legendary folk rocker David Crosby tonight. Now, lately, I met Crosby once, had a nice conversation. He was very nice to me. And I want to discuss this guy. I mean, you could talk for this cat Crosby has literally had 9 lives. And you can talk about him for hours. He's such a fascinating individual. Much more fascinating than just about any rocker I can think of, except maybe Elvis, but Elvis in a different way. So I'm going to talk about Crosby, and secondarily, I'm just going to give you my speculation on why I think his bandmates, Stephen Stills and Graham Nash, and sometimes Neil Young, are not speaking to him anymore, along with Jackson Browne and apparently others too. It's very bizarre. I'm just going to give you speculation on things that I've heard about that part of it. So if you're looking for absolute fact, tune out now. I just have speculation on some things I've heard. I don't think unless we know them personally, especially unless we know Nash, who's kind of started to backpedal in the last couple of years, I don't think we'll ever really know entirely. So I'll give you my speculation. I'm going to be walking by the beach, try to give you some views of the ocean and the harbor. Hopefully it won't be too windy. And there we go. I can't stop, so I'm doing it. Hope you enjoy it. All right, so we'll turn around. We'll talk about Crosby. So if you don't know, David Crosby, it was a member of the group The Byrds. That was BYRDS from 1964 until 1967. They were huge for a couple of years. And then he was unceremoniously fired from the band, The Byrds, in 1967. And Roger McGuinn, the kind of de facto leader of the Byrds, said to him, "We think we'll do better without you," something that Crosby always loves to laugh about, because he then went on a year or two later and joined which became for a short time through 1969 and 70s, but continuing on for decades, one of the biggest supergroups ever. That would be Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and sometimes Crosby Nash, sometimes Crosby solo, and sometimes Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, when Neil Young would agree to play with the other guys and tour with them and do a record with them. So, David Crosby was born in Santa Barbara in, I don't know what year, I know it was in the 40s, and he was the son of a cinematographer. In fact, his father might have won an Oscar, or at least been nominated. So he kind of grew up, he didn't grow up poor, let's put it that way. His parents split up, which I'm sure was hard on him and his brother. And then his mother did live to, I believe, around 1974. So she did get to see Crosby's fame, but I just get the feeling they were never all that close. And I get that feeling about Crosby and a lot of people. Crosby did have a brother, as I said, named Ethan, who actually was kind of a folk singer piddling around down in Coconut Grove in the early 60s, which actually brought his brother David into that same life. But Ethan had mental illness and eventually went up to the mountains to sort of be a solitary mountain man survivalist, and he eventually killed himself. So it was just David in the family. Anyway, so Crosby tours around Coconut Grove and Florida, and he's playing solo, and at some point he meets Joni Mitchell, and they have a romantic relationship, and he begins touting Joni. He produced her, I believe, her first album, and starts bringing her around people, the rock community, as he, gets a little more well-known, and producers and things like that. So he was instrumental in the formation of Joni's career. And then she did break it off with him, and after that, she started going with Graham Nash for about a year. Anyway, so I'm going to run into some people here, not literally, but figuratively, and I'll pause when I do it, and then we'll come back to it. So, wow, look at that harbor, man. That's beautiful. I say man more when I'm talking about Crosby, because to this day, at the time of this filming, at about 80 years old, he still says man every couple of words. He is the consummate hippie. In a way, he's a hippie who also has had a lot of guns in his life, seems to like guns, certainly not a pushover, certainly not a pacifist. Anyway, all right, I'm going to have to pause here for a minute, and we'll come right back after we get past this crowd. Hear the music? Crosby would hate this music. He would detest this. But it's not even the 90s anymore. I was going to say the 60s or the 70s or 80s. Anyway, so David Crosby eventually is in LA, and he goes to the Troubadour, and he meets Roger McGuinn and Gene Clark, who are kind of trying to get together as a duo singing, and he adds his voice and he wants to sing harmony with them and form a group, and they do. They form the group, the Byrds. In my estimation, the Byrds were kind of five kind of arrogant, jerky acting guys. They weren't humble in the slightest. I think that's part of what blew them apart so easily too. It was also cool to never smile and kind of act kind of arrogant and tough. But I think that the egos and of course the drugs got in the way, and boy did they get in the way of Crosby, Stills and Nash. So he's with the Byrds for a couple of years, and Crosby sort of becomes like a rebel within the group. They're not really liking his ideas about songs, so songs that he wanted to participate, that he was writing, like a song called Triad. They rejected. That was about Crosby and the threesomes that he would have. The romantic threesomes were his bag, and they thought it was not appropriate for their music. He eventually did record Triad and sang it with Crosby, Stills and Nash, and I think Jefferson Airplane might have sang it as well. He sang it with Crosby. He sang it with Nash. He sang it with Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. Crosby, Stills and Nash. So there was a rift growing, and David Crosby is, as he says in one of his songs, he says, "I'm the most opinionated guy in the world." I think it's part of what draws me to him, because let me say on the outright, personally speaking, yes, I did meet David Crosby once. He was speaking here in Los Angeles at, I think it was a school auditorium, and he was speaking about the dangers of drugs. This was after Crosby had gotten out of jail for drugs. He was, and it was probably part of his restitution, but afterwards there was a break, and he just kind of stood out on the steps, and I said, this was pre-internet, for those of you who don't know. There was a time pre-internet. This was 1989 probably, and I said, I really want to get your book. I've heard so much about your autobiography. And he was telling me to, how to order it through the mail in those days. Anyway, and I've liked the way he treated me then, although it was a brief conversation. I very much admire his intelligence. He's incredibly, incredibly talented. And if you're a guitar player, you know that, or you might not know, but David Crosby tunes down his guitar often. That's where he got the song for Guinevere and other his songs, The Lee Shore. There's just beautiful tunings, and his voice, at least through about the mid-2000s, was just like velvet. Just an unbelievable, smooth, powerful voice. He is a true musician. And Stills and Nash are both highly intelligent guys too, and as is Neil Young. These are guys who always wrote about real things. And you've got four type A, four alpha males. Crosby was thrown out of the Byrds because he was a one alpha male among the other alpha males. That was part of the reason. He also got up he filled in for Neil Young, who ditched right before Buffalo Springfield was going to go on at Monterey Pop. Monterey Pop 1967, David Crosby plays with the Buffalo Springfield, and he did a little speech about the Kennedy assassination, which I found very interesting, but the Byrds didn't dig it. They didn't like him going off with another band and giving speeches and pontificating. Just wanted him to keep his mouth shut, which David Crosby will never do. So David Crosby is a highly intelligent, highly outspoken person, highly talented, and speaks his mind and often gets in trouble for it, and a lot of times he ends up apologizing, although not always. He caves. So Fast forward, after 1967, he gets fired from the Byrds. He's having these threesomes. That's basically his life. And he is introduced either by, I think it was by Mama Cass Elliot. That's where the group's formed. Well, there's a little, I think either Crosby or Nash says it was Cass's house, and one of the other ones says it was somebody else's house. But Stephen Stills and David Crosby. Stephen Stills had been out of the Buffalo Springfield because that group basically self-destructed after about a year. And Crosby had been fired from the Byrds. David Crosby was trying to do solo and putting together a solo demo. Stephen Stills was also looking for a band or to do solo work, I suppose, probably solo, since he's talking about an egomaniac. But these two guys got together and were recording some demos together. And then there's a famous story, actually, where I think, in the beginning, it was probably at Cass's house, where they were singing together. I'll tell you in a second. Stills and Crosby were singing a song called, oh God, I forgot the name of the song. Is it In the Morning or You Don't Have to Cry? In the morning when you rise. It's on the first CSN album. And Nash heard them play it on acoustic guitars. And he said, play that a second time. Play that a third time. And the fourth time, he sang the high harmony. And the three-part harmony was so beautiful, they said, oh, that's it. And at that time, Graham Nash was still with his group, the Hollies, an English group that rivaled the Beatles in sales at various points. But he was very unhappy in the Hollies. He was the only one who smoked weed, and the guys were big drinkers, and he was smoking. His hair was long. He was, becoming sort of a hippie, and he was unhappy with where his songs were being limited. In fact, the Hollies turned down Marrakesh Express, which became a big hit for Crosby, Stills, and Nash on CSN's first album. So by fate, these three guys got together, Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and created this just tremendous sound. In fact, they always said they could play their entire first album in somebody's living room with acoustic guitars, and they often did. They went anywhere around Hollywood and around the music industry and played these songs. So they form. Let me say that during this time, remember I said that David Crosby had, the romantic life was basically threesomes. He describes it as saying he was an incredible narcissist. Isn't even a big enough word. He said his entire being was about seeking pleasure all the time. That would be drugs and sex, drugs and women, and that was it. I mean, that was the most important things in his life. Doesn't mention food, doesn't mention great political discourse or thought. It was drugs and women and having a great time. And he also says correctly, he was stoned every single day, every single time he was on stage. He was always high until he finally kicked drugs, supposedly, I believe it, in prison in the mid-'80s. But for 20 years, he was never not high, either making a record in the studio or on stage. So after, here's the ocean. And we're looking at Santa Monica, by the way, across the way. So CSN, Crosby, Stills, Nash, puts out their first album, and it's a monster hit. And David Crosby has been going with two girls. They started as part of the Byrds fan club when they were teenagers. Christine Hinton and her friend Debbie Donovan. But at this point, into 1969, Christine Hinton had sort of become David Crosby's live-in main girlfriend. So at one point, they moved out of Beverly Glen, out of Los Angeles, and they moved up to Northern California, Marin County, I believe Novato specifically. And this was September of 1969. And that particular day, and Crosby was very much in love with Christine Hinton. And what happened with Christine Hinton has affected his life probably to this day. Now, would he have married her? I don't know. I mean, it was understood with her that he would never be faithful, entirely faithful. And I don't know if marriage was in the cards in his, at that age for him, in his 20s. But he, by all reports, was very much in love with her, and they were having a great time. And one day they were at their home, and they were close to the Grateful Dead ranch as well, and they were friends with the Grateful Dead. And Christine Hinton and her friend decided to bring a bunch of cats that they had. I don't know how many cats, I say a bunch, but some cats to the vet. Well, they were in like a VW van that I believe her friend was driving, and the cats, at least one of the cats apparently got out in the van, was running around, and they reached back to try to control the cats, get them back in the cat carriers, and a oncoming school bus crashed into them. And Christine Hinton, I believe, was killed instantly. And they called David Crosby, and he went to and he has this terrible story he tells about, and Crosby's very honest. When I told him I wanted to read that book, it's his first biography. Well, yeah, I don't think he's only done 2, but it was called Long Time Gone. It was published in 88 or 89 after he got out of jail. Yes, mostly for the money, because he owed over $1 million in back taxes when he got out of prison in 1986 or 7, but I'll tell you about that. But also, it was a very heartfelt book. It was written by him, and they have his first person accounts in the book, and then his friend wrote the other half of the book, which is Carl Gottlieb, who wrote the screenplay for Jaws. Anyway, but they describe in the book and other places how Crosby got the call about Christine. They're driving to the hospital. On the road, he sees the car demolished, and supposedly he said, "Oh God, I hope they lived." He gets to the hospital, and he sees an ambulance attendant mopping up the blood. There's so much blood out of the ambulance, and he says, "My girlfriend was I think in that ambulance. Is she okay?" And he says the attendant just kind of put his head down and looked down, didn't say anything. Anyway, he was told Christine was dead. He had to identify the body, and there's a very interesting quote that Graham Nash has said, and I can understand it. He says, that day in September 1969, he said, Crosby woke up that day one person, and he walked out of the hospital after seeing Christine's dead body another person, and he hasn't been the same since. And I believe that. So Crosby, who had always been sort of the life of the party, very gregarious, very outgoing, he fell apart when Christine died, crying jags for weeks, months on end. It's when he first tried heroin, anything to kill the pain. In fact, his new friend, Graham Nash, agreed to go on a sailing trip. A tour was canceled, and Crosby had bought a boat, which actually was here in Marina del Rey a couple of years ago. I saw it, called the Mayan. Nash agreed to go on a boat trip with Crosby on the Mayan and sail around the world, not the whole world, but sail around for months on end, because Nash said he was worried that Crosby would have killed himself, and he might have killed himself. So through the years, Crosby, Nash, and then actually David got with Debbie Donovan, became his main girlfriend, second of the, number 2 of the threesome, and Debbie actually had a daughter, and it's either Debbie Donovan or her daughter Donovan Ann. One of them does not speak to David. I know he has said that. But they had a child in 73, and he basically got all the women he was with from 1969, 70 on addicted to drugs. Now, Debbie Donovan became a Christian, found religion, and flourished after that event, after their breakup. But anyway, David Crosby is a very strong personality, and throughout the 70s, part of his problem was the unresolved grief over Christine's death, and he really changed after that. They said he became more closed, paranoid, closed off to people, angry, not the friendly, outgoing, loose, hippie life of the party anymore, but his personality really changed. A lot of anger, and I'm sure this was a guy who started out with depression issues, and the unresolved grief just made everything 1,000 times worse, and he didn't release it for about 15 years. And I'll try to tell you that story too. So Crosby, Stills, and Nash continue. They do another album called Deja Vu with Neil Young. And I can't go into all the politics of Neil and the guys because it would just be too long, other than to say that they are 4 highly egotistical, highly intelligent, highly talented men who are all alpha males, all type A, perfectionists, especially Stills, and especially Neil Young. And they would butt heads all the time. They made great music, but they would butt heads all the time. And for years, they wouldn't record, they wouldn't speak to each other. Nash would be stealing Stills' girlfriend, and then somebody. There were a lot of fights over women. Nash was known to steal girlfriends, like I'll think of the name later. Crosby wrote a song called "Cowboy Movie" about it. So Stills wouldn't speak to, Nash for the longest time. Then they'd get back together. They'd talk again, begrudgingly. Then in the mid-'70s, Stills and Young were going to do an album and put Crosby's, Nash's voices on them. Crosby and Nash had to go back and finish their own album in California, so Stills wiped all the vocals out, and then Nash would curse Stills, say, "I'm never going to work with that son of a bitch again." And this dysfunctional relationship between these four guys has gone on literally to the day of this filming, except it's the worst it's ever been now. Throughout the 70s, every year you can start it. What really happened was David Crosby was used to use weed, used to smoke weed all the time, and then it progressed to cocaine in the early 70s, especially after Christine died. And then he couldn't do cocaine through his nose anymore because he was kind of the same thing that happened to Stevie Nicks. He was ruining his nasal membranes. So he drank it for a while, and then he heard about freebasing. And freebasing, which started for him probably in between 77 and 78, was the worst thing that ever happened to David Crosby, because he became highly addicted to cocaine and heroin. And in 1979, he and Nash were recording an album, and Nash saw Crosby stop the session because Crosby's freebase pipe slipped off an amplifier and shattered into a million pieces, and of course Crosby went nuts. And Nash said the drugs mean more to him now than me and the music, his best friend in the music. And remember, Nash had stayed with Crosby. He would give his right arm for Crosby to keep him from killing himself 10 years earlier. So Nash naturally has always felt that Crosby was indebted to him. And you know what? I think so too. Anyway, so the years go on and Crosby's drugs escalate. 79, 80, 81, 82. Every year is worse until Crosby and Stills decide to make an album together in 1981. Record company flat out rejects it, says you got to use Crosby. They didn't want to use Crosby, who was so strung out on freebase. I mean, it was like really bad. It was to the point where Crosby had to freebase like every 27 minutes. There's some number where he had to have it all day long. He was having grand mal seizures on tour. He needed money for drugs, so he was doing solo tours since Stills and Nash were freezing him out, and he got busted a few times. He was having seizures. He got his girlfriend, who later became his wife, Jan Dance, co-addicted. So here they're both addicted to freebase, and his life is about scoring. He got involved with a drug dealer, a major dealer on the West Coast, who became his de facto manager in the late 70s, early 80s. And this guy and others tried to get Jan away from him. They had bikers come over and beat her up and hold her hostage and say, "You're messing with Dave's head. You're holding him down. He's got to get away from you. He can't sustain his lifestyle and life with you." And Crosby called other bikers to go over there and free her. It was just, Crosby's life was about bikers, cocaine, heroin, and Jan, and trying to make enough money. Picture this. This was a once wealthy man trying to make enough money every day to score. And that's what he'd do. Every day he'd wake up in his house in Mill Valley and he would go out and try to score drugs. And have to. If he didn't, he was gone. He even had a musician staying in the guest house, and he would go out, and he and Crosby and Jan would go up and rifle through his food and his whatever pills he might have had in his cabinets, trying to make base for cocaine. I mean, he was as much a degenerate junkie, drug addict as there can be. And so was Jan, but I'm talking about Crosby now. So they reluctantly, Stills and Nash reluctantly take him on in 1982, and David brings songs from a rejected solo album, and they make the album called Daylight Again. Although Crosby's participation was minimal, but the public really didn't know this. They didn't know how strung out he was till he got a couple arrests and busted. And then Crosby, they play. It was the US Festival, one of the festivals in '84, I believe, where I think Nash actually went on the air with an interview and talking about David's problems. And by now, the public knew Crosby was, because Crosby had been busted a few times. In fact, eventually, there was a People magazine article which Crosby hoped would give sympathy to him, and he hoped the judge in these cases he was facing, these drug-related and weapons-related charges, would find sympathy. And I think it was called Cocaine and Crosby, and it was very unsympathetic. I mean, the writer described how he went to Crosby's house. Crosby was living on a mattress with Jan that had holes on it in their living room. There was cat feces everywhere. He had open sores on his body, as did Jan. Jan wouldn't wash her hair. It hurt her body too much to wash her hair. She was down to like 90 pounds. Crosby had, like I said, the scaling and the sores on his body, and always had to stop to do freebase. I mean, how they lived through the mid-'80s is unbelievable. And by this time, obviously, wasn't able to perform with the group anymore. But it didn't last long, because then Crosby was busted a couple of times for various things. One was after the drug charges, which is like stay out of trouble, and an arrest in a little nightclub in 1982 when he was trying to do a solo thing because the guys wouldn't play with him. He was busted for freebasing. Somebody tipped the cops off in the little green room they had. He was sitting around with people freebasing. And he was busted there, and he said, "Don't get in trouble again. I won't get in trouble again, Your Honor." And then he did something with his motorcycle. He ran a red light or knocked some board off a guy's fence up in Mill Valley. And finally, Crosby was busted again to the point where it was Thanksgiving 1985, and he knew he was going to jail. And he said he'll die in jail. He couldn't handle jail, and he couldn't handle living without drugs. And let me back up and say that there was a time before this when there was an intervention staged at Crosby's house. And of course Nash was there, and Jackson Browne was there. And Jackson Browne actually rented a plane to fly Crosby all the way to a private plane to Scripps in San Diego and try to dry out. In 1983 and maybe 1984, there was a couple times where Crosby went to rehab and walked out. And he said in his book, "I wasn't ready, I blew it. I was turning a corner and I blew it." You got to get to your lowest point before you decide to save yourself. That's what they say. So, flash forward to the fact where Nash is writing the judge, saying, he needs rehab, he doesn't need jail. Crosby eventually goes to prison, and he's there for about 10 months. Not very long, but long enough to get clean. And that was the turning point in his life. After that was the years following, is like when I met him, when he was, like I say, he had written the book with Carl Gottlieb. He's back with Crosby, Stills, and Nash. He's sober, he's clean, he's doing his shows, and he's getting money. Nash actually helped him rent a place in Encino here in Los Angeles, and Nash gave him a Mercedes. All this because he was broke, completely broken in debt when Crosby when he came out of jail. Nash was a tremendous friend to David Crosby. So through the years, through the decades, they keep playing together, and in 1994, Crosby discovers that he has hepatitis from using needles over the years, and he's in liver failure, and it's getting worse and worse and worse, and he's going to die. And he went on a boat, his boat, the Mine, with Jan and some other people, and they said he was in terrible shape, and the toxins were going to his brain, and he was near death. And they finally found a match. He was on a short list of liver transplant recipients. Nash actually went with the doctor at 5 in the morning. The doctor actually called Nash, said, "We found a liver. Do you want to go with me to the hospital?" Nash rode with him at 5 in the morning. They went to the hospital. Nash stayed at the hospital throughout the whole surgery. David came through it. He needs another miracle. He needs a regimen of pills every day, just anti-rejection pills. And that's what happened. He kept playing with the group. He was concentrating on his sobriety, his new liver. He had a real bad motorcycle accident in the late 90s, which he recovered from. I mean, this guy just keeps going. But with social media, David Crosby found it easier to start speaking out, and he has a lot of things to say, as do I, obviously. And he doesn't he doesn't have a filter, and he's always admitted he doesn't have a filter. So at some point in about 2015 or so, or maybe later, two things happened. This is what I know about. The first thing is that Neil Young starts going with Daryl Hannah, the actress, who coincidentally had been years earlier with Jackson Browne, their other good friend. So David says some derogatory things about Daryl Hannah, and Neil Young is furious, won't forgive him, won't talk to David anymore. And, Neil also probably feels indebted because he had said in the 80s, if you clean up your act, I will do an album with you guys again. And he did in 1988. There was a Crosby, Stills, and Nash Young album that Neil did because he was coming through on his promise. So you picture all these guys probably feeling, geez, David really owes us a lot. But he doesn't always act like it. So he badmouths Neil Young's girlfriend in about 2014, 2015. And there was another issue. The other incident was Graham Nash had written a book around the same time. I think it was published around 2015. It was an autobiography called Wild Tales, which is the name of one of his songs, one of his albums. And I heard that Crosby trashed parts of Wild Tales. Now, I read it, and I don't remember any real derogatory stuff that was that striking from Nash about Crosby. I mean, he was still his brother at that point. He loved him. Nash loved him like a brother, more than a brother. Nash says that Crosby and he spoke nearly every day, if not every day, for 45 years. Even if Nash was at his home in Hawaii, on Kauai, and Crosby was here in California, they spoke for 45 years. And then somehow between the incident with Neil Young about Daryl Hannah and the book, and maybe there are other things that happen that we just won't know about because Nash won't seem to tell us. He just said that Crosby ripped the heart out of Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. And he says we're not gonna play together. Now, at the time of this recording, that was a few years ago, but Nash seems to be softening just a little bit. But I'll tell you, apparently Nash, Stills, Young, and I believe Jackson Browne do not speak anymore to David Crosby, and that just blows my mind because these guys were thick as thieves. Not so much Stills and Young, but certainly Nash, and Jackson Browne was a great friend. So I don't know what happened exactly other than those two incidences, and maybe David just opened up his mouth too much. He tends to go off. Sometimes he apologizes. Most of the time he ends up apologizing and he caves. Sometimes he doesn't, but most of the time he does. He has said he would love to be, friends with these guys again, but I think he's kind of given up on this. So David Crosby, at age 80, has to do, solo concerts and albums when he can. He's put out a lot of CDs from 2015 to 2020, 2021, 2022. And in the hopes of surviving. So, I just want to financially surviving. So I just want to add one more thing, and then I'll end it. Is that I was telling you about how Crosby finally came to terms, maybe with his grief about Christine Hinton. So he was in a hotel, and I don't remember where it was. This was like in 2014. He's with Jan. So remember, this is 25 years post. After getting clean. So drugs weren't involved. He's watching the movie The Fisher King. This is a very dark, great movie. I believe it was directed by Terry Gilliam of Monty Python, formerly of Monty Python, starring Robin Williams and Jeff Bridges. And I think he knew both those guys already. He's watching Fisher King, and there's a line in Fisher King where, near the end, Robin Williams, I don't want to give it away, but he says something that evokes something in Crosby. And Crosby broke down, and he said, I'm in there in the room watching the movie with Jan. He says, I'm weeping and crying so hysterically I thought I was going to have to go to the hospital. In there, Jan says, this is about Christine, isn't it? That reminded you of Christine, and you're sort of letting it all out. And Crosby agreed. I don't know where he's come with his grief then, but I think that if he hadn't buried it back in 1969, his life would have been different, because I was going to give a whole speech on how men are sort of taught. I don't want to make this about gender, but we men are, we don't sit around with our male buddies and cry and hold hands and cry together when something sad is happening. And I don't mean that as a joke or funny. It's sad that we can't. I wish we could. The only place I think men might talk about their sadness, their depression, their anxiety in a 12-step, or with a therapist, or with a really sentimental or really sympathetic girlfriend or wife or husband. But it seems to be difficult for us to do, and I include myself in that too. And I say that because David Crosby included his psychiatric reports in the beginning of his book, the Long Time Gone book from '88, the psychiatric reports when he was admitted for his drug dependency in 1983 and maybe beginning of '84. And they say narcissistic, probably clinically depressed, need for attention from others, all these things where you can see how, if you're into psychology, and I certainly am, how Crosby had been bearing and bearing. This is a very emotional, sensitive guy, like creative people are, generally speaking. He'd been bearing all this pain, bearing it all these years, bearing it. I do things to get rid of my pain and help me along, and unfortunately David chose drugs to, self-medicate, and it almost killed him. But he's the cat like Keith Richards, who has 9 lives. But Keith Richards being very British, stiff upper lip, I don't know how much we'll know. Although he has an autobiography too called Life, which I read, but he's not as forthcoming about his emotional state as Crosby is. Anyway, very long video. Thanks for sticking with me. You can tell that Crosby is of great interest to me, and even though I only met him for 10 minutes, he's a fascinating guy, and it'll be a loss when he goes. He's a symbol not just of the 60s, but he's Americana. That's all I can say. All right, folks, that's it for tonight. Thanks for bearing with me if you watch the whole thing, especially. Give the channel likes. I'd really appreciate it. I always love your comments, and I will comment back, as you know. And subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you at the next location. Thanks, guys. Talk to you later. Bye. Whoop. Okay. One last look at the harbor, and now bye.